Pepe, it's a pleasure to speak for the first time. How are you, sir?
Wonderful. Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
Well, there's a lot going on. We were planning to do this sit down for the first time to discuss the developments in Venezuela, which are pretty extraordinary. And those came days after the alleged attack on Putin's estate by Ukraine, which Russia responded to yesterday with the Oreshnik missiles towards Lviv that no one's talking about because we have the largest protests, some say ever, but since 2022 in Iran, and a lot of people talking about the potential collapse of the Iranian regime. So there is a lot happening as the year kicks off. What is your, what's your stance on the state of affairs right now, especially focusing on the developments in Venezuela and what's happening in Iran?
Well, Mario, we could spend a whole day talking about it here. So let's try a Hollywood version, right? Like if we're pitching a series. Venezuela was essentially, as we all know by now, a desperate move related to the demise of the petrodollar. That's the major headline. Of course, there are many superimposed headlines, including, of course, the usual suspects maneuvering in the back, and I don't need to name them. People who can profit from an annexation of Venezuela, testing the national security strategy, a graphic test showing not only to Latin America, for the rest of the world, that yes, this is our backyard. And of course, now we all know the president of the United States saying, this is my backyard and I own it. Which reminds us of the famous, you break it, you own it. So is he ready to own Venezuela? Is he ready to go against the will of, I would say, the overwhelming majority of 28 million people? Against the will of most people in Venezuela who are still Chavistas? Against the will of this new government led by Delcy Rodriguez, the daughter of a slain revolutionary killed by the CIA. She is an old school Chavista. Very, very competent, lawyerly background, very well educated, an excellent negotiator. But she keeps the interests of Venezuela, I would say, way, way above of the interests of the president of the United States. So obviously behind this, I wouldn't even call strategy, this reckless, illegal act, and we're being very diplomatic here, there was no strategy. There was no thinking ahead, okay, what happens next? There was not even thinking ahead in terms of how we're going to reorganize the Venezuelan oil industry to our American interests. This is the theme of my latest column. And I talked to Chinese experts, among others, and obviously people from Venezuela. It would take, at best, 5 years to recondition the whole, let's say, ecosystem of the energy industry in Venezuela for American needs. And to start making money out of it and to have Venezuela produce, I would say, a mere 3 million barrels a day, which is not much. It will take 16 years and $183 billion of investment. Are CEOs of American companies ready to spend that kind of money? Obviously not. And many of them, via, I would say, indirect ways, have already told the White House, look, we're not into it, as long as we have total guarantees about our investment. How can you guarantee an investment in a country that, if the Trump administration decides to install a fifth columnist government after they'll see, it's going to be total chaos. There's going to be an extra humanitarian crisis. How are you going to invest in a country under total chaos? So obviously none of that was thought in advance because the ego of Neo Caligula had to be appeased. And that's where we are at the moment.
A lot of people were worried, or not worried, were some were hoping, some were worried that Maria Machado would be the person that Trump chooses to take over from Maduro. And that's
Exactly.
what a lot of people that don't like Maduro were hoping for. But instead, with what Trump and his administration have done is support the vice president, threaten her, but support her. The vice president has made comments about obviously criticizing the attack, which you'd expect her to do so, but also talking about working with the US. We even got reports that there was a call between the president of Colombia and the American president. President of Colombia was very critical of the US. Today, I think I saw reports about Mexico saying they're going to work with the US on the targeting of cartels there. Isn't it possible that the US has worked with the vice president, maybe spoken to the vice president or people around her? Because from what I understand, when I spoke to experts, Venezuela is not only about Maduro, it's about Maduro and others in his circle that all hold power together as a group. And others in that group, the head of his security apparently worked with the US. Some people are reporting that's the case. Some people theorizing that
by the Venezuelans. Yes.
Exactly. Yes. I think, he was arrested, wasn't he?
Yes. Very important, Mario. I got a non-confirmation from our Venezuelan sources yesterday night. He's not been arrested yet, but he has been demoted as a head of military counter-intel and the head of the Presidential Guard. He could be arrested.
But you'd expect him to be, him being demoted, you'd expect that to happen because there was a significant failure for the president to be captured the way he was. Whether there was a stand-down order or not, at least at minimum, there was an intelligence failure. So you'd expect the head of the Presidential Guard to be demoted. If he's arrested, then it might mean there's something more sinister happening. Do you think that he was maybe involved in the operation? Okay.
Well, according to our Venezuelan sources, yes, he was. The thing is how they'll see is going to sell this to domestic public opinion. This is a very hard sell. She will have to explain to the overwhelming majority of the Venezuelan population, look, like the head of security of our president betrayed him. And this is practically, it's practically 100% sure by now. And many other people in his circle. So the initial narrative, now it's, well, that's the usual White House narrative. It's much more complicated than that. Of course, the usual CIA suitcases full of cash. This is something that I have seen in my professional life everywhere across the global south, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, you name it. Obviously, they work in Venezuela, but up to a point, because they didn't manage to enlist very, very high people in the military hierarchy. That's still over there. Padrino, the Ministry of Defense, is still there. And when they sit for their meetings, they'll see sits in the middle, Padrino to the left, Minister of Defense, and Diosdado Cabello, Minister of Interior, to the right. So, you know, the hardcore of the government is still there. So the regime change, which was, I would say, the dream of Trump 2.0 from the beginning, it didn't happen. They only had this mini Netflix special full of special effects, and that's it.
Why do you think it was a regime change that was planned? Because does Trump really care about having democracy in Venezuela, or does he care about having American interests advanced?
It's not about democracy, Mario. Regime change in terms of having a pliable fifth columnist working for us, Americans.
But if the current regime accepts, if the current regime accepts to work with the US, then America has achieved its mission, its objectives.
Work with the US has many nuances. Don't forget, Delcy is a very able diplomat. It's no wonder that she is extremely admired by Sergei Lavrov, which is the #1 diplomat on the planet. They get along very, very well. Lavrov respects Delcy's expertise as a diplomat. She's an excellent negotiator. She was already talking to the Americans even before the coup against Maduro. She was talking to Marco Rubio on the phone. Of course, they have to talk to somebody. And the Americans knew that they had to talk to somebody at the high levels of power, whatever happened next. So they'll see in terms of, you won't buy, they'll see. The Americans, they don't know how the mentality of exponents of Chavismo work. They have Venezuela's interest, as they define it, up there. They have the memory of the revolution. They have the memory of everything that they learned directly from Hugo Chavez. They have been under horrible sanctions since forever, and they still resist. So this is the most important element. Of course, Delcy simply cannot antagonize Trump frontally, because she knows what will happen. And Trump already said it. If she doesn't work with us, we're going to bomb Venezuela again. And then he changed his mind, or maybe not. And he will change his mind tomorrow. So she knows she's dealing with an extremely volatile, megalomaniac narcissist. But you know how to deal. For instance, I'll give you another example of a head of state who knows how to deal with Trump. Lula from Brazil. When they met in person, Trump was even impressed, because Lula is an excellent diplomat and negotiator. So you have to talk to them. As dangerous as they are, you need to talk.
The unpredictability of Trump, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
isn't that an asset though? Wouldn't you? I was speaking to a negotiator a couple of months ago, talking about Ukraine and how Trump was handling the Ukraine negotiations. Unpredictability is an asset when you're negotiating with someone, because when they make a threat, you don't know whether they're serious or not. When he says to Iran, "I'm locked and loaded," or when he says makes a threat to Colombia, which is a bit more empty, but let's use the Iranian threat, which has more weight behind it, then Iran, they don't know if he's serious, if he's going to immediately do it because he said it, because a lot of times Trump says things but does not do them. But at the same time, in other cases, he says things like the threat to Iran before the 12-day war, or the threat to Maduro before the capture or the kidnapping, and he delivers on those promises or those threats. Isn't that an asset that Trump has? And then maybe you could use that to segue into the threats to Iran, and whether we could see similar approach to Iran as we saw in Venezuela, maybe an emboldened U.S. administration taking action in Iran.
Well, it's the same old Nixon madman theory, right? This is nothing new. He's copying Nixon. And it doesn't impress high-level players and mature players. In the case of Iran, I can tell you by personal experience, out of my visits in Iran, my last visit in Iran was 7 months ago, even before the 12-day war. They're not impressed by Trump. They know that he's completely unpredictable, volatile, etc. They concentrate on American acts. That's different. And it's true. They were caught napping before the 12-day war, and they won't be caught napping now. They are ready not only for an attack, an Israeli-U.S. attack. I've been talking about this with people in Iran these past few days, but there's even the possibility that they have almost, I would say now, between 90 and 95% of all the assets in place for a preemptive attack, if they feel that an attack by Israel, U.S. is coming. So they are not impressed. The Russians is different. The Russians, they were never impressed by Trump. They know Trump very, very well. They know how to deal with him and appease his ego, which is a sign of diplomatic finesse. And they know that they cannot trust over 90% of what he says. So they concentrate on the acts. So what they have been concentrating on these past few months, very, very important for you, Mario, and our audience. The attacks by NATO on the nuclear triad structure in Russia. First one was May last year. And now, finally, the attack on the command and control center of Putin's Novgorod residence, and Putin was at the residence. This is a huge compound, which includes one of the residences of the president of Russia, but also a command and control center related to the nuclear triad. They called the American military attaché to the Minister of Defense in Moscow, and they handed over evidence that the US was behind it. So this changes completely the narrative of Trump is interested in negotiating a peace deal with Russia. He might be not, but everybody that is around him that exercise power related to organizing an attack against a Russian, very, very important asset, they are not. So they deal with facts, with acts, not with these, talk show ebullient explosions. The Chinese, the same thing. The Chinese are even more circumspect. They know exactly they're dealing with a Nixon madman character. They never advertise how they're going to answer intimidations or harassment by the Trump administration. And you see this much, much later because the Chinese think extremely long term. If the Russians think long term, the Chinese think long term plus 10. So these three major players, I mentioned these three major players because these are the three major players in terms of the so-called threats to national security until the NSS. They're not impressed. And at the same time, they know they have to deal with it non-stop. It's a very complicated diplomatic balance. But when you compare the sophistication of the military diplomatic arrangements in Iran, in Russia, and in China to this bordello circus in the US, it's more than obvious for anyone following politics that this is a completely different ballgame here.
Well, if you look at the facts on the ground, over the last years even, people have loved to criticize the American military capabilities, especially with the war in Ukraine. A lot of people saying Russia was able to advance in Ukraine despite NATO and American support. The counter argument is that America was only sending their older equipment. That's a separate debate. But people criticize the American military more than ever before. But if you look at the performance of the US and their allies, especially Israel, in the last 3 years, you've got Iran's proxies decapitated, Hezbollah being disarmed, Yemen in shambles, their leadership killed by Israel. Assad has fallen, a very close ally to Russia, less so to China. You've got Iran went through a 12-day war that caught them by surprise. Their economy, their currency is collapsing. Their currency is lowest it's been ever. And they're facing protests that are, at the moment, the worst since 2022. If you look at the speed in which they're spreading much faster than 2022. And they're instigated by something that's more concerning than 2022. It's not social issues. It's economic issues. It's the economy stupid. The economy tends to be the downfall of most authoritarian regimes. And now in a shock operation, a very successful one militarily, you've got the leader of Venezuela, which is very important, especially for China, as one of the largest oil reserves. Actually, the biggest proven oil reserve is in Venezuela. Number 2 is the Saudi. Number 3 is the US. And they've lost Venezuela. They've lost Maduro, at least. His regime is still in power, but the US is by force controlling the oil exports out of the country. Doesn't that, just looking at those facts alone, it looks like the US has placed the alliance, the Russian-Chinese alliance, in a very tricky position. China lost all these important proxies. It seems less and less reliable. And Russia, while busy in Ukraine with those small advances, we don't know how heavy the cost is to the economy. Depends who you speak to. Losing their allies as well. America seems to be winning in the last 12 months. Do you disagree?
Completely. And it's not a matter of winning or losing, Mario. Geopolitics is not about winning and losing. Geopolitics is a very long game. You have small victories. You have maybe sometimes what could be seen as an enormous defeat, a strategic defeat. But this is, the whole thing is being recycled all the time, and it's in movement. Okay, I'll give you a few examples. Hezbollah was decapitated, yes, but the new leadership is being, it was already groomed before. I was in Lebanon a few months ago. I talked to Hezbollah people. I said, it's going to take a while, but we're going to have it back because the new level of leadership is as good as the previous one that was decapitated. So that's not, Hezbollah is a movement. Hezbollah doesn't depend on personalities.
Can I ask you a question on Hezbollah? Can I ask you a question on Hezbollah before we go to the Yemen and the others?
Yeah, of course.
So with Hezbollah, when you look at them now, the government is saying they're disarming them. They're being bombed by Israel without responding. That has never happened before. In 2006, they responded very decisively. After the war in Gaza, they responded very decisively. They haven't responded in over a year militarily. And they've lost their shipping routes through Syria. And now Iran, their main sponsor, is facing internal struggles. We don't know if the regime will fall. Wouldn't that show that Iran's biggest proxy, biggest weapon, is the weakest it's ever been?
It's not a question of proxy or Hezbollah being an Iranian weapon. You have to go to Lebanon. You have to go to southern Lebanon. You have to talk to people who live in southern Lebanon, side by side with occupied Palestine. And you have to talk to the intellectual leadership of Hezbollah to understand why Hezbollah exists and why it is a flaming idea of a movement with a communitary spirit, which is also a military movement. Then you understand that this thing cannot be exterminated just by decapitation strikes. It's much more complex than that. This is a story for cheap headlines, essentially. Of course, they haven't bombed anything significant these past few months because they are reorganizing their arsenals. They continue to be heavily militarized underground all across southern Lebanon, close to the Israeli border, especially. And intellectually, they are reorganizing how they're going to function without a charismatic leader like Nasrallah. Apart from his capabilities, he had charisma. He was a pop star, and not only in Lebanon, all across the Arab streets, everywhere, even in the Sunni Arab street. So it's a long-term process. Yemen is the same thing. I was in Yemen a few months ago. I was talking to them over there. They took me to the north of Yemen because they wanted to show me where Ansarallah was born. When you talk to them on the spot and when you see the depth, reach, and how solid these movements, which are not only military movements, but religious and moral and humanitarian movements as well, then you understand that this is a very, very long game. And of course, they're prepared for setbacks. And don't forget, these people, they have been fighting for at least 2.5 millennia in the case of the Yemenis. So, you know, they put this in perspective. It's not if they have setbacks only a few months ago that the whole thing has collapsed. In Iran, we could have a gigantic conversation about that. I hope we can have this in the near future as well. At the moment, we are having, once again, I talked to my contacts in Iran these past few days, and I asked them directly, what is the main reason for this protest? They said, yes, of course, it's economic, it's cost of living, it's inflation. There are numbers circulating in Iran that the real inflation is something like 35 to 40%. It's probably much more than that. And the fact that with reals, you cannot buy anything. You need some strong currency to buy anything. So you cannot pay your bills, essentially. And the government came out with a subsidy that it's pitiful when you look at it. But of course, they were infiltrated from the start because this is the playbook of the color revolutions. As a foreign correspondent, literally everywhere, I've seen this in front of me for decades. The last time I actually saw it in front of me was in Hong Kong in 2019. Exactly the same thing. Exactly what happened yesterday, you know, setting fire to buses or to entrances of metro stations. It's the same playbook everywhere. Of course, there is enormous discontent. Sorry, Mario, just one moment.
Please, yeah, of course.
I'm sorry.
Please. No.
Just to finish this, there is enormous discontent, and it proceeds because don't forget, Iran is under sanctions for 43 years, 44 years already. It devastates their economy. I'll give you an example for our audience as well. A few months ago, I was doing a documentary about an international north-south transportation corridor, and I went to the Caspian Sea to one of the ports. When I arrived at the port, Bandar Azali, I asked my Iranian host, okay, where is the port? They said, this is it. I said, guys, you cannot have a port like this in the Caspian, getting vessels from Kazakhstan and Russia. There's no infrastructure. The infrastructure was the same of the mid-70s, probably. And this you see in front of you the effects of 40-something years of sanctions. So this applies everywhere in Iran. And people still survive, which is, wow, I don't know how none of us in the West can possibly understand how they do it. But, and of course, there is mismanagement, there is corruption, and there's no question about that. But another thing is when you have economic protests and protests against inflation, the cost of living, they are hijacked by foreign actors to turn into a regime change playbook, which is exactly what's happening nowadays. And this is what you hear from Iranians themselves, not from us, foreign.
America has been very clear. Trump's been very clear. He wants to topple the regime. Israel's been even more clear. They want a regime change. They said it very openly in the 12-day war. Now, it's hard to measure, because when you have a protest, the way like for the one in Ukraine, for example, when we talk about the protests there, it's,
you're talking about the 2014, you mean?
The Maidan Revolution, yeah, the Maidan Revolution. You could have a protest that has domestic support, but also be supported by foreign intelligence. It doesn't have to be binary where a protest is purely domestically supported with no foreign meddling whatsoever, or I don't think it's possible to even have a protest that is completely orchestrated by a foreign power with zero domestic support. It needs to come, both factors need to be involved for a protest to succeed. Now, to which degree each one is contributing to it depends who you ask, and you might have spoken to people there, you have a good sense of it. If I speak to people on the other side that are critical of the regime, they say, no, it's all Iranians. You don't blame it on the CIA, whatever, because it's an easy thing to do for any regime facing protests. Blame it on foreign powers. It's a normal playbook. And then you speak to people that are supportive of the regime. They make a very valid claim that is backed by words from Netanyahu that Israel wants to topple the regime, and they have presence in Iran. I think that's undisputed. Now, these are things that can be disputed and debated. There's also facts on the ground. The facts are that Assad is gone. The facts are that Hezbollah is not responding militarily to Israel, as I said earlier. And that the government, the president himself said he wants to disarm Hezbollah, and the government voted to disarm Hezbollah, which has never happened. The facts are that Yemen stopped responding militarily against Israel. The facts are that as much as critical as you are, I'm very critical of Israel, especially when it comes to Gaza. The facts are that Netanyahu has still got significant domestic support, and Trump's trying to get him a pardon. The US is still supporting Israel. Maduro is gone. These things have not changed. And Iran, so while Netanyahu is getting great support domestically, Iran, people are debating whether they're going to survive these protests or not. And you cannot debate that these protests are the most severe since 2022. Whether they're going to get worse, whether the regime will be toppled, who knows? And just to be clear, I'm not for the regime getting toppled. I don't like the regime because I really worry about what the alternative is. I think regime changes, look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Iraq, regime changes could result in, even if Gaddafi was a horrible person, could result in a significantly worse outcome. But would you disagree with those facts in the ground that maybe Iranian regime will survive, but it is at its weakest point ever, if not in decades? And if you do disagree, I'd love to hear why.
No, it's not. Well, I wish we had time to go point by point about all these facts on the ground that you mentioned. Yes, some of them are facts and some of them are non-facts. They are prefabricated facts. The protests are a fact. You can say that the whole framework of the Islamic revolution, now it is a challenge because they have to explain to the new generation something that they never lived, why there was an Islamic revolution in the first place. People who are the Gen X or Gen Z members in Iran, they have no connection to what happened in the late 70s or in the early 80s. It's very complicated. And of course, and this is from the point of view of a foreigner who's been to Iran, I don't know, 10 times, 12 times at least. Since the Khatami era, I'm going to Iran. Their horrible economic mismanagement, no question about that. They don't know how to manage their economy, but there's always a nuance. Because, first of all, because they've been under horrendous sanctions. And it's very, very hard, even if you're not a good economic manager, to make a country work under these horrible sanctions. So, of course, this alleviates a little bit their, let's say, most of these religious clerics, they are incompetent economically. There's no question about that. I had discussions with these people. For instance, I was trying to explain to them the Belt and Road Initiative by China, and some of them wouldn't even understand what I was talking about. And these people had positions of power. It's very, very worrying, you know. This doesn't go, of course, to the top. For instance, the former president Raisi was immensely, he knew everything that was going on geopolitically. He was very, very good at the highest level, much more competent than the current government. And the current government, there are a lot of people who say they are not strong enough to go against the maximum pressure policy of the previous administration and now Trump 2.0. So Iran is an extremely complex society because there is actual debate. If you go to an Iranian cafe outside of Tehran, in Mashhad or in Kazan, etc., people are discussing politics. It's wonderful. And don't forget, they have fabulous universities, and the universities, they promote debates all the time, including debating the political arrangements in Iran. So as a form of grassroots democracy, you see it in Iran working in front of you. That's the good part of it. It's not a matter of condemning or accepting the regime. For instance, in my case, I had to give an idea, Mario, I had to study Shiite theology when I started going to Iran because I was interviewing ayatollahs. If you don't know theology, you cannot have a proper interview with an ayatollah or a high religious cleric. So you dig deeper into Shiism and you learn a lot about Shiism as a religion and as a method of government. And of course, it's not a matter of agreeing or not. You see how they apply that to running a country. It's an immensely complex subject. Sometimes the fact that the country has not collapsed yet after 40 years, it's in itself a miracle. But it's true. Nowadays, they have to reorganize the way their political economy, that's to go straight to the point. They are considering that these alliances that they have and are very, very close with Russia and China are benefiting Iran, but this is a long-term process. They know that they are part of BRICS, which is very, very important because they can sit with the BRICS members and also the BRICS partners and put their problems on the table, and this will be discussed by everybody, Russia, China, India, Brazil, etc. And their relationship with these three top BRICS, India, Russia, and China, is close enough to the point of of course, I'm not saying if they are attacked, they're going to be defended by RIC, Russia, India, China, no. But they have Iran's back in many other levels. For
What
instance,
are those levels? Yeah, I would love to see the levels.
Exactly. Just one example, Mario.
Please, yeah.
Do you know who rebuilt in record time the Iranian grid after the initial Israeli attack, the 12-day war? And this happened in maximum 48 hours. It was
Russia?
never advertised by anybody, the Russians. Nobody knew that the Russians were there, and nobody knew that the Russians, of course, the Russians have the hardware and the software and the knowledge to do that. But they did this quietly. So these are ways of, and for instance, the configuration of the port of Chabahar in the Sea of Oman as a big node of this international transportation corridor. India is directly involved, but in the background, the Chinese as well. When I was there a few months ago talking to the authorities of the port, they said, yes, we have Chinese ships from Shanghai coming here all the time. And that will improve. Yes, please, go ahead.
Wouldn't it be scary to be an ally of Russia and China at the moment? You got Maduro out.
I like the good question.
Hezbollah's out. I just thought of it now as you're speaking. Hezbollah's out. Khamenei's out. America's blatant, I'd say, military, not like essentially not having any restrictions in chasing their interests militarily, along with these, when I say America, along with Israel, has really put a target on pretty much anyone that stands in their way. And Russia is in a tough position to be able to support those people, as we saw with Armenia, Azerbaijan, because they're busy with Ukraine. And China have a policy of non-intervention. So considering those facts and their way of doing, doing business or doing politics, it seems pretty scary, to say the least, to be an ally of those two countries and stand in the way in the US. Is that a fair observation?
No, but they don't think in these terms, Mario, the leadership in Beijing and in Moscow. Well, this is one of the things that us foreigners, we have to understand. It's part of my job. I go to Russia and China frequently. Like in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'll be going to China, and then I'll be going back to Russia. Wow. You have to be there, you have to talk to them, and you have to understand their long-term game. In terms of China, not only you have to understand their 5-year plans, which now are reaching 2035. It's not even the next one. They already have 2 5-year plans in place.
China's incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. And you have to understand the previous 3,000 years. Seriously, because when you are in the middle of a conversation with an academic or somebody from the government, they throw you a metaphor from one of the dynasties, and you have to know, oh shit, which one is he talking about? Because they reason in terms of figures of speech and metaphors and images directly related to their history, and they bring that and apply to modern China. It's a fascinating process, but for us foreigners, it requires an enormous effort to put this into context. But it's a long-term view. For instance, I think the best example at the moment is does China want de-dollarization? Not exactly, and not now. What do they want? They want most of the global South doing a trade with them in their own currencies or in yuan, period. This is what they really want. It's not de-dollarization. It's, in fact, a de-dollarization de facto, right? But it's not like, now we, China, are going to create a new international currency. No. The Russians, the same thing, and the Russians under much more severe questions than China. They are testing different, I call it the BRICS lab. Inside the BRICS, they're testing different payment systems, settlement systems, 3 or 4 at least, and some other outside. So in the next, I would say, 3 years, around 2028, 2029, this will arrive at the BRICS table and said, okay, can we agree on a completely different payment system apart from SWIFT and apart from the dollar, that all of us on the table agree and our partners also agree? This is where it's going. So it's a long-term process, you see?
Yeah. Going back to Venezuela, another one of China's allies, we talked about Iran, and Iran and Venezuela have a lot of similarities in the case that both were incredible, vibrant economies. Iran before the revolution, and Venezuela before Chavez and before the sanctions. So some blame socialism, some blame sanctions, I blame both. But if you look at Venezuela, for people that don't know, the economy shrunk by 80% since Chavez, since 2013. Living standards down by 74%. Oil production, it's a big one, dropped by 80%. It was I think it was the wealthiest country in Latin America at one point. the inequality reached high levels, very high levels. And a lot of people left. I think a quarter of the population or a fifth left, and 43% of the population post the 2024 elections were considering leaving. That's half the population considering or wanted to leave. Now, I'm a person who's critical of regime changes, as I said about Iran, not because I like the regimes in question. I'm a supporter of democracy, but because historically they haven't gone really well. And generally, the country that's leading the regime change, the US, Russia, whatever country you want to point at, they do it for their own interests rather than the interests of the country that's being targeted. Now, Venezuela, at the beginning, when I first heard about the military intervention, I told my partner, I'm like, okay, this is pretty messed up. The US is bombing Venezuela. This is freaking crazy. I never thought that would happen. Then when the operation ended, we found out they went in, captured Maduro as bloodless. And then when it evolved and Trump distanced himself from Maria Machado and even praised the vice president, some light praise, and then later threatened her, I'm like, okay, hold on. This is removing Maduro, showing American might, breaking international law. That's been the case for decades. I think international law in general is in question, unfortunately. Trump being Trump, but they did not change the regime. I'm not sure if we're going to see the same thing in Iran. We'll talk about that.
They could not, Mario.
They kept the regime. Okay, so you think so? Would you say that this may end up positive for Venezuela if they continue working with the current regime, and the vice president is more open to working with the West and better at managing the economy than Maduro? She could still be loyal at Maduro, but be more open to collaborating with Big Brother upstairs. And allow the economy to flourish. So could we actually see a successful operation there, even though I know you're critical of it? Could it end up being positive for the country, or you're extremely more pessimistic than I am?
Well, for Venezuela to start working properly again, the first thing is to eliminate the sanctions. Simple as that. Try telling that to Trump and to the US Congress. There you go. That's number one. Number two, they'll see, once again, I have to tell you and our audience something very important. They'll see is an excellent negotiator, and she's very well prepared. And she knows how to deal with pressure. So, for her, dealing with Trump is part of the job. That's not a problem per se. Also very, very important. She has the support now of over 90% of Venezuelans. What did they see a few days ago, and what the rest of Latin America saw a few days ago? The gringo comes here and snatches a president from his bedroom in the middle of the night. If you talk about this, Mario, with somebody in a favela in Rio, somebody in a really nice churrascaria in Buenos Aires, somebody eating a ceviche in Peru, the reactions are going to be the same. This is our hemisphere. You don't do this to us. You stay over there, gringo. This is our land. Don't mess with us. And this is something that you have to listen to in the streets, not, of course, talking to hedge fund managers in big tower blocks in the big capitals of South America. That's a completely different story. Santiago, Buenos Aires, or São Paulo, etc. That's not. But this is the 1%. What Trump did, he managed to antagonize the whole of Latin American public opinion against him. That's not a very, I would say,
most Latin American countries did not. A lot of them did not recognize. A lot of them didn't recognize Maduro, though, either. A lot of them didn't like Maduro.
No, this is the Venezuelan middle class, and because of extensive propaganda campaign, the Venezuelan diaspora who lives in Miami, the people who are paying Marco Rubio's bills, essentially. The Cuban diaspora and the Venezuelan diaspora living in Miami. And for them, Miami is much more important than Cuba or Venezuela. This is the key characteristic of Latin America and South America comprador elites. Anything in the US is better than in their own country.
But most countries didn't recognize Maduro, though. Most of them did not recognize Maduro as president.
Who?
Most Latin American countries did not recognize Maduro after the 2024
Of
elections.
course, because they were under pressure from the US, or they had their own comprador elite regimes. And even more complicated cases, Mario, and I have to stress this because it's extremely important. The most important nation in Latin America is Brazil. The Americans know that. They always knew that. They cannot allow Brazil to become a global power in their own hemisphere. The problem is Brazil cannot rely on Lula, because the Lula that we know today is not the Lula of 30, 40 years ago that many of us grew up with and learned to respect. Lula doesn't want to go back to jail again. When he left jail, he received a key visit by Jake Sullivan at the time, who read him the Riot Act. Jake Sullivan basically said, look, we did everything to get you out of jail. Now we have to follow what we want you to do. And with Trump, it's even worse. It's even worse because it's frankly antagonizing Lula and Brazil as a member of BRICS, because the Trump 2.0 war is a hybrid war against BRICS as a whole. And Brazil is one of the top BRICS. So inside the government, just to tell you how complicated the situation is, the Brazilian foreign ministry, they are essentially Atlanticists, and they think that we need to have some sort of accommodation with the Americans. They vetoed Lula approving Venezuela becoming a member of BRICS. I was there when it happened. I was at the Kazan summit of BRICS in Russia in October 2024, and it dropped as a bomb. It dropped the day before the start of the summit that Lula personally had vetoed in a meeting Venezuela, and even Venezuela as a partner. So Venezuela could not be, all the decisions on BRICS are by consensus. So this was the work of the Brazilian foreign ministry. It was not even Lula himself. Even though Lula does not never approved Maduro like he did Chavez, Lula idolized Chavez totally. But he never thought that Maduro was up to...
Chavez had a lot more support than Maduro. Chavez was elected. Chavez...
No question about that. Exactly. But yeah, go ahead, please. Yes.
I was going to ask on Maduro, though, would you criticize, without supporting the operation by the US? I think it's very normal for anyone to be critical of the operation in the US. Venezuela is a sovereign country. Military action against a sovereign country is against international law. So it's very easy to be critical of that. But is it fair to say that Maduro did a bad job at managing Venezuela's economy, and maybe Delcy could do a better job, or the new regime, the new leaders of the same regime could do a better job than Maduro? Is that a fair statement?
Delcy could do a better job. I agree with you completely. The problem is Maduro maybe was not up to the task of managing a situation where you are under total sanctions practically, and you don't have partners among your neighbors in Latin America. So this was very, very hard to manage. This guy, his background is as a union laborer and negotiator. And he's not Lula. Lula learned on the job how to be a president, and he was an extremely effective president in his first two terms. Maduro is not Lula.
Exactly. Like I know the sanctions played a role. The reason I asked you that question is Iran is under sanctions, has been under sanctions for decades. So is Russia, more sanctions than both. And both economies, Iran's not doing great, but better than Venezuela under Maduro. Russia's doing better than both. Under Maduro, we saw the biggest peacetime refugee crisis in human history. So that's why I say that sanctions obviously were horrible for the economy, and it's a strategy to pressure any country that is not advancing America's interests. It's very fair to say. But at the same time, there's a lot of mismanagement there that led to Venezuela to where it is today. And my view...
Yeah.
I agree.
No question.
And the last thing I want to get your thoughts on, Pepe, is what does the instability in Iran and the risks of the regime falling, now whether it's going to fall or not, time will tell, and the capture of Maduro, along with everything else that's happened in the last 12 months, along with the negotiations between Trump, Putin, Zelensky, the attack on Putin's residence, the Oreshnik missile that was launched against Lviv, putting all these together, where do you stand on the Russia-Ukraine war and the negotiations that are ongoing right now?
Well, to put it bluntly, Mario, very pessimistic, especially after the attack on Novgorod, because this was, I would say, the straw that broke the steppe camel's back in the case of Russia, because now they have, as we commented, evidence that certainly they could not say Trump, obviously not, but the CIA for sure. And the question is, was Trump in, or or they bypassed him? Very hard to imagine that he didn't know that this was going to happen. So now the whole kabuki of Kirill Dmitriev, Jared Kushner, and Witkoff, now it revealed itself for what it is, a kabuki. And it's not the most important vector of trying to find some sort of understanding with the US. And this is something that I'm starting to discuss with my Russian connections. And there's a feeling of, okay, this is we are entering another stage. And the stage is, it has already been explicitly, the warning already came explicitly from Lavrov. The SMO will be decided in the battlefield. And there's no other possibility. There will be no ceasefire. There will be no Trump peace plan, whatever. That's it. So, they keep going through the motions of this kabuki, of course, which is probably what's going to happen. And this Oreshnik warning, it's only the second time that they launched an Oreshnik. And they launched to a very, very specific target, which is a mix of command and control center around Lviv, which is one of the most important for NATO, and an underground gas storage facility, and 150 kilometers from the Polish border. So this message was for the Poles, not for the Ukrainians, essentially, and for NATO. Basically, the message is, look, we can do this anytime we want. We can obliterate one of your bases in 10 minutes. Do you want to keep going with your escalation? Okay, you got the message. So now we are in a much more volatile and dangerous stage of the war. And from the point of view of, if you start looking at the body language and what Putin has been saying and what Medvedev has been saying, and even Lavrov, they're starting to be really fed up. And I think the velvet gloves that they used so far are going to disappear soon. So this means that this war won't be solved in 2026. It can, if the Europeans want their forever war, which is what they're doing, and here in Europe we see this every day. Not only NATO, Rutte in NATO, but the leaders of the nation states in Europe. If this continues, the war can go on for at least for another 2 or 3 years, with horrible consequences for everybody, especially for Europe, because Europe, they cannot pay for this war without plundering their own tax-paying citizens, and people are starting to do the math here, everywhere across Europe. So I'm sorry to be so realistic with you, but it's bleak. Going ahead is going to be bleak. Yeah,
that's not good. Well, Mr. Escobar, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure
to have you again.
Of course. Yes. Thank you very much.